In late 1903, Heinrich Eukens and Max Lutzow would come to the island of Cabacon in German-occupied New Guinea. By the end of 1904, neither of them were alive. In 1905, Wilhelm Radke arrived on the island, only to leave 2 months later in poor health. Later that year would come August Bethmann and Heinrich Conrad, 2 well-known German vegetarians. Conrad would leave before the end of the year. Bethmann was dead by 1906. His wife went on to successfully convince the German government to forbid people move to the island. All of these people were drawn to Cabacon by the same siren song, the promise of a new life, a life spent communing with God in ways that those living in industrial societies had forgotten, eating his fresh fruits, basking in the light of his sun, bathing in a secluded lagoon. No more war or vice or meals prepared from the bodies of our fellow animals. Cabacon was the promise of eternal life without suffering, the prototype for what was to become an equator-spanning anti-industrial civilization under tropical sun. This never panned out. All Cabacon would ever end up becoming was a graveyard, the final resting place of several intelligent men swept up in a river of delusion. What happened here? It probably doesn't help that vegetarianism in 19th and early 20th century Germany was just full of problems in general. I wouldn't say it was universally problematic, since I don't speak the language that a majority of the relevant history is written in. But while I'm not an expert on historical German vegetarianism, I am pretty well read in the American hippie movement, and I recognize a lot of familiar issues in what's available to be read in English. It's easy for someone with niche, radical ideas to fall into traps laid by anybody else who seems to share their values, especially when the niche in question is built around science that's not understood all that well, or that one party understands much better than the other. So, as tragic as the story I'm about to tell is, it seems inevitable in conditions that were just about tailor-made to generate cults. Our protagonist today, and it's important to remember that protagonist doesn't mean hero, is August Engelhardt. After graduating from college, he spent some time living in Jungborn, an alternative medicine-based commune founded in the Harz Mountains by one Adolf Just. Adolf preached your usual natural remedies, but another big component of his philosophy was the idea that just spending time in nature offered many health benefits. He advised sleeping on the ground in a hut with no lockable doors or windows, for instance. It's probably worth noting that Jungborn looked like this. Engelhardt's time in Jungborn was brief, but Adolf's ideas would stick with him through the rest of his life, especially the theory that spending time in nature could improve your health. During his time in the commune, he would begin developing his own ideas. They had a lot in common with Just's ideas and with the theories of many other German vegetarians of the day, but there were a few key differences. Where Just spoke of the health benefits of living outside, August focused in particular on the sun. He believed that the sun, with its position right at the heart of the sky, was the closest thing to heaven that could be seen and felt from Earth. He believed in man as a tropical animal who was meant to spend his days roaming naked through places near the equator, the sun beating on his back, energizing and healing him with the light of heaven itself. This was how he believed Adam lived in Eden, and he'd make returning to Eden his life's ambition. The most infamous of his idiosyncratic beliefs developed alongside his views on the tropics and the sun. While many vegetarians of the day believed in a diet consisting of uncooked ingredients and raw fruit, Engelhardt thought even that was too much. Too frivolous, too worldly. His heart was set entirely on one fruit, the coconut. The coconut grew further up in the air than any other fruit he knew about, putting it closer than anything else to heaven. Also, its round shape and hair lent it some similarity to a human head. A fruit created in the image of man, who was in turn created in the image of God, placed closer to heaven than any other fruit. The coconut was clearly the most holy fruit of them all. His ideal society, in a nutshell, was a world where men lived at one with nature, eternal life granted through the healing powers of the sun and the coconut. He envisioned a girdle of islands across the equator, where man could finally rediscover peace, innocence, and enlightenment. There would be no need for medicine, for God's gifts would be enough to prevent illness. There would be no sex, no women at all, for the men of his palm temple would live forever. The first generation to live as Engelhardt envisioned would be man's final immortal generation. His worldview now set in stone, he wrote treatises and gave lectures on his Palm Temple, first in Jungborn and then throughout Germany. Despite widespread public ridicule beyond the safety of the commune, by 1901 he had amassed a sizable following and soon enough had a sufficient number of people that he could begin planning and funding his new Eden. He informed his followers that plans were underway and began asking them for money in exchange for a place in his tropical paradise. He'd allow anyone to visit so long as they were, quote, men of noble and excellent character, and of course, so long as they were willing to part with a little bit of cash. There's not a good source on how much exactly he charged his people. A New York Times article from 1905, which I consider a pretty unreliable source overall, claims it was $250 for people who had that much money, or a sum equivalent to their means for any poorer followers. If you were flat broke but could prove your devotion, you could get on for free. This is a big part of why I don't see Engelhardt as a scam artist, as so many cult leaders are. I think he really only wanted the money so he could buy land. That's what makes him so interesting and so dangerous. He was a man genuinely convinced of his delusions, who had a way with words that convinced dozens of others that he was onto something. He surrounded himself with people who rewarded his delusions, showered him in praise and money instead of offering him the help he clearly needed. Thing is, his story, or the basic facts of his story at least, isn't unique. Alternative medicine is just like that. It's a world that rewards people for being seriously delusional and shuns them for seeking the sort of help that would bring their delusions to an end. It's a never-ending downward spiral that still hurts people to this day. But even now, in our truly bizarre age of fad diets and horse dewormer, I don't think anyone's gone as far as Engelhardt did. To my knowledge, he is the only person who's ever purchased an island for the sake of alternative medicine. He set sail for German New Guinea alone, planning to discover and purchase his Palm Temple long before inviting anyone else to join him. It took him a while, but by September 1902 he'd found it. The island of Cabacan, uninhabited save some natives at the other end, was the Palm Temple exactly as he'd envisioned it. This was where his utopia, later called the Sonnenorden Cabacan, or the Order of the Sun Cabacan, would take its roots. To quote a truly gorgeous passage from the aforementioned New York Times article, this was the happiest period of his existence on the atoll. He had left the world behind him. He was free. At dawn, nature feasted his eyes with beauty as the sun, his god, climbed over the horizon, tinted the palm crests with gold, the sea with amber and opal and crimson, and bathed the kneeling figure on the beach with a mantle that was his inspiration. By day, Engelhardt's joy was that of a dream realized. At sunset, the lagoon clasped his god in a broil of molten lava. Then came the night, with the great dome of stars, the breeze rustling through the cocoa fronds, and the Pacific chanting like a great organ, lulling him to sleep. So I understand why journalists don't write like that anymore, but it'd be really cool if they did, right? Anyway. He lived on Cabacan alone for a long time, naked, eating coconuts, bathing in the lagoon, and basking in the holy equatorial sunlight. The natives largely avoided him, seeming baffled by his existence. The other white people they'd encountered all spent a lot of time trying to look respectable, wearing nice clothes and flaunting their wealth and power over the natives. And then there was Engelhardt, a scrawny, hairy goblin of a man who ran around naked, ate coconuts, and slept on the floor of a little hut. He had nice things. He regularly wrote to Germany, and his hut contained a small collection of books. He had the means to buy an island. He held all the power of a white man, but without any of the predictable sanity of every other colonizer who'd come before him. Back home in Germany, many of his followers were starting to see him the same way. With his gift for persuasion so many miles distant, it didn't take long for people to poke holes in his worldview and completely check out. Some also more than likely just got sucked into other cults, unfortunately. By the time the first ship arrived, only 2 of the once dozen-strong cult of Engelhardt remained. Heinrich Eukens and Max Lützow would arrive in late 1903, greeted by a now unrecognizable Engelhardt. In their eyes, the man was living proof of his own ideals, lean and golden brown, the first of a new race. For a short while, the 3 men shared the same happiness Engelhardt had felt when he first moved to Cabacan. But the sudden change in environment and diet was too much for Heinrich. He contracted a fever and died only a few months after his arrival. At first, his death threatened to break the spell of the Palm Temple. The two survivors spent weeks wandering aimlessly around Cabacon, solemn and uncertain of their faith and their future. Eventually, though, they'd find peace of mind. Creating a utopian civilization from the ground up couldn't be accomplished without some sacrifices, after all, and perhaps some men simply weren't strong enough to survive in this brave new world. Of course, neither of them were without what they would perceive as fault either. Both men still clung to some worldly possessions and ideals. Max, a composer in his past life, could never forget the joy music had brought him. Every day he hummed some classical tune or other from memory. August hated it, not for any religious reasons, but simply because it was annoying. They argued over the music constantly until it completely drove them apart. One night, following a particularly bad argument, Max approached a Wesleyan missionary ship that had anchored itself in Cabacon's lagoon and asked permission to stay with its crew until they left. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into when they said yes. Loyal to his last breath, Max continued to follow his religious beliefs aboard the ship, eating fresh fruits and fresh fruits alone and basking in the sun atop its scalding hot wooden deck. This was fine, if a little awkward, for a little while, until the ship suddenly lost its mooring and drifted out into sea for 2 days. Out in the open sea, on a ship without any fresh fruit to its name, Max continued to follow his beliefs. For 2 days he ate nothing and lay motionless on the deck in open sunlight. By the time the ship returned to Cabacon, he was dead. His body was returned to Engelhardt, who buried him. The crew of the ship offered to return him to civilization, which sent him into a fit of rage. He told them this was his island, his utopia, and he'd stay as long as he could manage, even if it meant living alone again. Before they departed, he forbade they ever return. August, once a man with a unique gift for bringing people to his side, now only seemed capable of pushing others away, or pushing them into unmarked graves. 1904 would only get worse for him when a storm destroyed most of his coconut supply. Grieving and now without food, August entered a state of mania. The natives found him, covered in tropical ulcers and muttering to himself, and took him to a doctor on another island. The moment he recovered, he returned to Cabacon, his island. In 1905, things started looking up for the poor old creature, as he would finally regain something he'd long since given away: company. Wilhelm Bradke joined him for 2 months before he realized how unhealthy all this was and left. Later that year, though, he would receive 2 more permanent guests. A pair of fairly respected German vegetarians, Heinrich Conrad and August Bethmann, came to Cabacon in June. Conrad would also tire of the lifestyle quickly, departing in October. But Bethmann stayed loyal. The 2 men would send letter after letter to Germany, desperate to finally start building their utopia in earnest. Engelhardt's vision had stumbled out the gate, but surely with a noted vegetarian and fellow August at his side, the hard times were finally over. Anna Schwab joined the Palm Temple after months of pressure from August Bethmann. She was the first and only woman to ever join Sonnenorden Cabacon, and would become Bethmann's wife not long after her arrival. She made him change his lifestyle, broadening his diet to other tropical fruits aside from coconuts. 2 months after her arrival, he was dead from malaria. Engelhardt was furious. He blamed her and her heretical insistence that August Bethmann eat something besides God's divine nut. After enduring his ire for 2 months, she would return to Germany and become a vocal public opponent of Sonnenorden Cabacon. It didn't take long for her to convince the government to take action. Engelhardt was made responsible for burial and departure costs, and official recruitment had to come to an end. Civil servants were required to provide a warning to anybody who intended to move to Cabacon. The next few years were uneventful. Same old thing. Somebody would show up and either die or leave. By 1909, Engelhardt was alone and sickly, the only white man on the island and the owner of nothing but a hut and a dying coconut plantation. Until former Cabacon inhabitant Wilhelm Bradke swung by to give him a hand out of nowhere. They entered into a business partnership, and Bradke was able to get the plantation up and running again. But he left for a reason, and he'd make his concerns known to Engelhardt. He said of August's eating habits, quote, "Better to eat pork and live than to eat coconuts and die." And he was able to convince the now horribly malnourished man to diversify his diet. That allowed him to regain some of his lost strength, though he still struggled with tropical ulcers, including a particularly horrible one on his leg that he would have until the date of his death. His business partner would take over the old hut, while he would move to a humble lean-to, where he struggled with sand flies, which didn't do a whole lot of good for his health. Despite this, he was in fact gaining his strength back and decided to use some of his newfound power to become a writer. He began to write and publish a bi-monthly German magazine titled The Sun, Tropics, and Coconuts, which lost him a good deal of money and didn't gain Cabacon any new residents due to Bradke's decision to impose a 3,000 mark entry fee. Along with the pre-existing charges and warnings from the German government, not to mention uprooting your whole life to live on a nearly uninhabited island, Cabacon was a prohibitively expensive cult at this point. It wasn't doing so well as a business venture either, and by 1913, Bradke was out of the picture, succeeded by a lineage of plantation managers who would last only a few months each before either dying or leaving as soon as they could. But by early 1914, things were looking up again after Engelhardt received word from an American vegetarian named Mr. Luss. See, exoticism was gaining a lot of popularity in American vegetarian circles. They wanted a version of going back to nature that was a lot flashier than options like Jungborn, and the tropical life in Cabacon seemed like a perfect fit for them. Plans were made, and Lust's followers were ready to travel across the world to their new life among golden sands and palm fronds. Engelhardt felt as though he might finally be heading towards the palm temple he'd envisioned all those years ago. Gee, this sounds promising. I sure do hope nothing happens that makes it impossible for Americans to travel to German New Guinea in 1914. Oh, right. So that's basically it for Old August. Near the end of 1914, Cabacon was captured. Occupying forces all but ignored him as a worthless crank. Journalist Gordon Thomas visited in 1915 and described August as a shadow of his former self. After Gordon's visit, he had the island all to himself. He was found dead in 1919. His library, notebooks, paintings, correspondence, and most other possessions were bequeathed to a Dr. Berenwenger in Berlin, but the documents have never been located despite several requests. That's a shame, but then basically everything about this story is a shame. There's little in this world more disappointing than optimistic idealism gone wrong. Vegetarianism is a movement with noble goals, and so is Christianity. Engelhardt, in my eyes, seemed genuine in his beliefs. He lived his ideals to the end and truly thought that they could lead to a better world. He was also responsible for many deaths, and that shouldn't be forgotten nor forgiven. But I don't think of him as a villain at the end of the day. Just a delusional man given power instead of help. As I mentioned before, I think there are a fair few parallels between this story and the American hippie movement. That movement, too, was founded on radical, ambitious, and often agreeable goals. It also fell apart in large part because of a tendency towards unsafe and delusional practices. Engelhardt was a man totally convinced he was doing something amazing, struggling towards a new Eden for the sake of all mankind. This was an intelligent, well-spoken man whose life was wasted on fantasies that nobody told him were fantasies. He lived and died by his beliefs and took friends and followers with him. I can't help but think of Mark Vonnegut's book, The Eden Express, a memoir recounting his time in an isolated hippie commune and his return to civilization after he developed schizophrenia. Mark got better. He wrote a good book and became a doctor. August Engelhardt was born into a world that hardly understood mental illness and fell in with a crowd who, even if medication was available, would have gladly encouraged him to stay off of it. It's hardly a unique story. To this day, thousands of people refuse medication thanks to pseudoscience and other absurd conspiracy theories. Many also refuse to medicate their family, including kids. It's easy to rationalize mundane, small-scale delusions like that. Drugs are scary, stigmatized, full of nasty potential side effects. And who are you to tell me how to raise my kids, damn it? The truth is, we only care enough to retell stories like August's because they're so colorful. Look at all the articles about him online. He's not remembered as a dangerously ill man who convinced a bunch of people to go off and starve themselves to death on an island he owned. He's mostly remembered as a kooky German guy with a coconut cult, and that is how I present him at the beginning of this video. There's hardly any information on Jungborn in English, and I couldn't find much on his victims. We remember him. We don't remember the world that created him, and we certainly don't stop to think that maybe we're still living in that world. The world is full of August Engelhardts, people who lose themselves to bizarre beliefs and end up hurting the people around them in the process. Over the last decade, I've seen this story play out again with one of my favorite musicians, Kanye West. He created an environment where his friends and fans were all mindless yes men, and fostered a relationship with the media in which his obvious spiraling wasn't taken seriously at all. It was often rewarded, in fact. It gave him publicity, and it gave the media a source of cheap laughs and cheaper clickbait. Everybody won. This has happened before, and it will happen again. There's no easy way to stop it. But I think we can all do a little better at not encouraging it. And that's the only decent ending I could come up with for this one. But hey, if you heard that kind of shitty ending that I wrote at 2 a.m. yesterday, that means you made it to the end of this video. And I appreciate that. I'm still finding my bearings as a writer, and definitely as a presenter. I mean, look at this getup. I can't count how many times I sounded like some kind of monotonous robot throughout this video. I'm not good at this yet, but I appreciate you giving me a chance, and I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'd love to write professionally someday, and I hope that this is a step towards that, maybe? It's 1 in a million, but, you know, maybe I'll make gas money off of this someday. In any case, you know, I mean, I love to express myself through writing about history, through writing about anything, and yeah, I love talking about weird little niche stories throughout history like this, and I appreciate anybody who cares enough about the stories I tell and how I tell them to hear me out to the end. So thank you if you made it this far.